About 80 kilometers south of Baghdad, Iraq, are several large mounds with debris that span over 3 millennia. Known as Tel al-Uhaymir, it was pretty clear to the locals that this was once the site of some settlement, but which one, how large, and how old was unknown. Finally, in 1852, French archaeologists began the first excavations of these mounds, and the objects that they discovered were incredible. In fact, so much was found that various teams of archaeologists kept coming back to the site, the most significant being a joint expedition consisting of members from Oxford's Ashmolean Museum and the Field Museum of Natural History of Chicago, who dug there from 1923 to 1933. Other excavations followed, and work was really only interrupted when the political situation became too dangerous. For example, during the years of the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. Almost as soon as that war ended, a team from a university in Tokyo resumed digging in 1989, and only ended their work due to the crisis created after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait a couple of years later, and the first Gulf War that followed. What kept bringing back so many different teams of archaeologists to this one place? It's because they were digging at a site that, along with Uruk, Ur, and Babylon, was one of the greatest urban centers in all of antiquity, the city and kingdom of Kish. Kish is one of the most historically significant cities in the history of ancient Mesopotamia. The earliest layers, at which numerous shards of pottery have been uncovered, seem to go back to at least 5000 BC, when the site was occupied by a people belonging to the Ubaid culture. For the next 55 centuries, Kish had been continuously inhabited until the Islamic conquest of the region in the 7th century AD. However, it was during the early dynastic period of Sumer, between 2900 to 2334 BC, that Kish was one of the most prominent and most powerful cities of Mesopotamia, and was recognized as such. According to the Sumerian king list, Kish's first dynasty held sway over all of Sumer after the world-destroying primordial flood. After the flood had swept over the land, and the kingship had once again descended from the heavens, the seat of kingship was in the city of Kish. In Kish, Gishur became king and reigned for 1,200 years. Kulasina Bel reigned for 900 years. The list goes on, and several other dynasties ruling from Kish are also mentioned on the king list, including one with a queen named Kubaba. Politically, whoever ruled over Kish was one worthy of respect and emulation. The early dynastic Sumerian kings, such as Mesenipada of Ur, Eanatum of Lagash, and several kings of Uruk, adopted the title King of Kish to demonstrate their dominion over the land. Whether they actually ruled over the city is another matter. The title in many instances seems to have been a ceremonial one, used by a given ruler to convey his ability to defeat enemies in foreign lands or hold some additional territory outside of his own kingdom. This may have been because it seems that it was Kish's rulers who often called the shots in Sumer, or at least held significant influence over it. The most famous example of this was King Masilim of Kish, who's recorded as arbitrating a border dispute between the arch-rival city-states of Lagash and Umma, sometime around 2500 BC. Kish's most impressive ruins, those of 2 mud-brick ziggurats and a royal palace, also date to roughly that time period. Due to its location just north of Sumer, many scholars have questioned whether it was actually a Sumerian city to begin with. In fact, noted scholars such as Piotr Steinkeller believe that Kish may have been the center of a Proto-Akkadian people who created a political and socio-economic system markedly different from that of the Sumerian heartland further to the south. For example, Steinkeller states that due to less reliance on farming, the areas north of Sumer may not have been organized into separate city-states, but a single political entity that stretched further to the north and the west all the way to the city of Mari, and perhaps even as far as Ebla. Partly due to this, some Assyriologists have come up with the idea of a separate Kish civilization that rivaled the Sumerians. This might be reflected in the old tradition of war between Uruk and Kish, as described in the poem of Gilgamesh and Aga. In that work, Aga of Kish tries to subdue Gilgamesh of Uruk, but is defeated by the latter, leading to the end of Kish's dominance over Sumer and the surrounding region. Though Kish may have been powerful, Sumerian society may have been more innovative in certain aspects. For example, in the development of a written script that was later adopted and modified by others, including the city of Kish, which had its own reputed scribal school based on the Sumerian model. Perhaps because of this, Sumerian language and culture may have been more represented in the archaeological record than those of the non-Sumerian speakers of Kish. It's also worth noting that this area, which we later call Akkad, was the ancestral home of the Akkadian king, Sargon of Akkad, who himself took over the city of Kish from its king, Ur-Zababa. From Kish, Sargon set out to create the world's first empire, which we call the Akkadian Empire. As far as we know, the city remained loyal to him during his reign between 2334 to 2279 BC. He even used the title King of Kish, as one text attribute to him states, Sargon, King of Kish, was victorious in 34 battles. He destroyed city walls all the way to the shore of the sea. Instead of making Kish his capital, as one might have expected, Sargon had a brand new city constructed for this role, which he called Agade. As Agade's fortunes rose, the political significance of Kish began to wane. Despite playing an important role during the beginning of Sargon's new empire, Kish's relationship with its Akkadian overlords became outright hostile by the time of his grandson, Naram-Sin, who faced massive revolts and opposition when he ascended the throne in 2254 BC. Kish, along with Uruk, were the ringleaders of a roster of rebellious cities that included Borsippa, Kutta, Dilbat, Sippar, and Kazalu. On what he would later call the Great Revolt, Naram-Sin tells us in an inscription about the impostors who raised arms against him. In Kish, they raised up Ipor-Kish to kingship, and in Uruk, they raised up Amar-Jirid to kingship as well. In short, it didn't end very well for the people of Kish and their city. Naram-Sin claims that he filled the Euphrates River with them and conquered the city of Kish and destroyed its walls. Further, he made the river run over inside it and slew 2,525 men in the city. Kish's decline, though, was only temporary. During the Neo-Sumerian period, and later the Old Babylonian period, Kish not only survived, but prospered, and a new ziggurat and temple complex were constructed for the city's patron deity, Zababa, along with a new scribal school that was founded nearby. Despite being a center of commerce and learning, Kish would from the 18th century BC onward always be overshadowed by the nearby city of Babylon, which in a sense replaced it as the most prestigious city in the region. That being said, it was still an important cult center, and later Neo-Assyrian records indicate that kings including Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal had its archives searched for important and rare religious and divination documents. Other texts from Babylonian archives indicate that Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned between 604 to 562 BC, spent generously for the renovation and upkeep of its temples. Though occupied, the next 1,000 years saw a great decline in both Kish's influence and population. During the Achaemenid Persian period, it began to transform from a city into a large town, as its residents began to look for better opportunities in nearby Babylon. This drop in population accelerated during the Seleucid era, when even more of the population, along with that of Babylon, were relocated to the new capital city of Seleucia on the Tigris. By the 6th century AD, the site was completely abandoned. The city that was once the seat of those who called themselves king of the world, was now just a group of abandoned buildings collecting dirt and dust, which over time formed the collection of mounds that we see today. So I hope that you learned a bit more about Kish, one of ancient Mesopotamia's greatest and historically influential cities. More on the way. Stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'd really like to thank Grenkick69, Jaap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Danielle Allen, Danny Van Eck, YNXTV, Robert Morgan, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Hurtado Correa, Michael Trudell, Franz Robbins, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.